right, well, good morning, everyone. Glad to see some of you came back. Haven't overwhelmed you yet. I was familiar with all the stuff that was going on in the canning class. We have 8 children, and so we grow 85% of everything that we eat. And so you can imagine we preserve hundreds, if not thousands, of quarts of food. And so our summers are busy, but my kids would not eat fruits and vegetables out of the grocery store. They would only eat what we grew, and they didn't like what was grown in the grocery store because it just didn't taste very good. So I don't know if you remember me telling you about that story about that dentist that bought the ranch, and then the horses wouldn't eat anybody else's hay afterwards. Well, that kind of happened with our kids too, is the same thing. I was having a conversation with Vaughn this morning. He was asking me a few questions. And I want to, if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed with some of this stuff, that's okay. Because I want to tell you that the vast majority of the agricultural world, not just the gardening world, but the agricultural world, is unfamiliar with a lot of this. They just follow what the university practices are for growing a crop. And they don't necessarily understand anything about their soil and how things are affected by that soil fertility. They only know as it relates to the crop that they grow. And you're not, like I said, you're not gonna grasp everything that you hear, but thankfully they're recording this so you can go back, and I've had to listen to things over and over and over myself. And if you think this is a lot, the deeper in you go, the more there is. And you think it's like getting to the top of that one hill, and you see, boy, that next one's even higher. So I think we'll talk about that on Sabbath, about higher ground. But so don't get discouraged if you miss something. I'm happy to, answer any questions if people have them in between. My wife always fusses at me because I come back lighter than I did when I left, because I wind up missing a lot of meals. But I'm doing pretty well right now. I've had every meal so far. So, but don't be afraid to stop me and ask me. This is what I do. This is my mission, and I'm happy to help people. I was sharing this morning that it's hard for me because there's only one of me. And so I only have 24 hours in a day, just like everyone else does. But I still am frustrated that not enough people ask. I would rather be run ragged than to know that more people know than to not have people ask. And don't be afraid to ask, because again, the vast majority of people, they're going on what somebody else told them to do or what they think they're supposed to do. And the unfortunate reality, just as it's true because we have a sinful nature, is the vast majority of the decisions we make are not very good decisions. And they're not based on very good information or knowledge. And so we just need to keep asking, and we need to keep pursuing a knowledge of the truth and an understanding of that, so that we can apply it and receive more and more of the blessings that God has for us. And not just receive them for ourselves, but be able to give them to other people, and share with other people. Okay, so we're going to pick up where we got stopped yesterday. I was a little fast on this pyramid here, but did you kind of get the idea that I was talking about with this? Is that there is a reason why things happen, and as you achieve certain levels of function, the problems that you're experiencing will go away. They're there because there's dysfunction. When you restore function, those problems will go away, and they're messengers for you. Don't make it your priority to kill off the messenger. People come and want to say, can I come to your farm? Now, I don't do this so much anymore, but they'd ask, can I come and see your farm and everything? And I said, or they'd ask, well, what do you do in this situation? I said, well, you may not want to do what I do in this situation, because a lot of times I would let things go because I wanted to see what the progression would be on them. And so if I did have insects, attacking something or whatever, I wanted to know if it wasn't fertility, because we're going to talk about, we're eventually going to get to environmental influences and external influences and everything, but if it wasn't fertility, what was it? And how would I address it? So sometimes you come along and you see some pretty pathetic looking plants. Not because I didn't know why they were that way, not because I wanted them that way, but because I was trying to learn and understand things so that I could help other people to know what was really happening. So, but the bottom line is, the more you can get that plant to photosynthesize, you're going to eliminate some things. The more you can, if you can get it so that you're fully metabolizing all the nitrogen going into that plant every 24 hours, you're going to eliminate some problems. If you can get to the point where those things are working and the plant can now start capitalizing on microbial metabolites in the soil and gain energy efficiency, you're going to eliminate some other problems. And when you get to the point where you have these surpluses and you're pressed down and overflowing, you're going to eliminate a whole lot of other problems. And eventually, all of those things that frustrate gardeners and growers can be removed as a frustration. And there's nothing worse than, I assume all you guys believe you should be in the country and you should be growing your own food and all those things. But there's nothing worse than going out and you put all this effort into planting a garden and sometimes the seeds don't come up. Sometimes the seeds come up, but they don't survive for very long. Sometimes they come up and the plant starts growing and everything's looking great, and all of a sudden everything starts falling apart, or the weeds just outrun you. I'll share an experience with you. We're going to do weeds right after this slide. But when I first went to Eden Valley back in 1992, they had a practice of taking, this is where I first learned about the modeling that I use, but they had a practice of taking horse manure and bedding from, lots of people around them had horses, recreational horses, and no, they didn't have anywhere to get rid of it. But at some point in time, Eden Valley had agreed to start taking all these people's horse manure because they thought, well, that's a good, we can compost that and we can put it on the fields and it'll be helpful. And it can, in certain circumstances, it certainly can. But again, I'll show you with that thus far and no further principle that there's a point at which you don't want any more. And when I first started learning this model and we started applying it there, we discovered why we had such a horrendous weed pressure problem. We would go out and cultivate when we were growing stuff, and we'd go out and cultivate. And there's a difference between cultivation and weeding. I'll get to that when we get to the weeding. But you'd go out the next day and it seemed like you didn't do anything. It seemed like, if you don't sever a plant right at the root top interface, if there's enough of the top on there still, a lot of plants will just regrow. And if there's enough of the root on the top, it'll do the same thing. But it seemed like we didn't do anything. It's like everything just rooted back in and more stuff was germinating and everything. Well, turns out that we had way too much potassium. The parent material was high in it, and then all that horse manure we were putting on was adding a whole lot more to it. And when you have lots of potassium, you have lots of problems, but one of the particular problems is it stimulates germination of seed. And so we'll get to just actually go there, because there are 1 million weed seeds per square foot on average. 1 million weed seeds in your soil per square foot on average. That is a battle you're not going to win. And so we need to discover why are the plants we call weeds growing there, and how can we best address them. And it's not just with a hoe. You can wear yourself out with a hoe, weeding. And they just keep coming and keep coming and keep coming. And so let's just dive into this a little bit more and see why it's such a challenge for most of us with the weeds. So let's look at some of the causes here. One of the causes can simply be the parent material. I just shared it at Eden Valley there. The parent material was granite-based, and it was just naturally high in potassium and magnesium. And so not we, because once I got there, I said, now we got to stop taking the horse manure. We can't add it anymore because it's free, but free is not always free. Well, in this particular case, it was horse manure, because horse manure tends to be a little bit higher in potassium than, but it could be others. That just happened to be the particular one that was causing a problem. So, like I said, free is not always free, and it's not always cheap, because sometimes it can cause you a lot of headaches and a lot of work that you otherwise might not have. So the plants are just, so that's one thing, is the parent material. And you'll discover if you go to different places and there's different parent material. You and I have parent material. You know, our moms and dads, our grandparents, all of those gave us, that was our parent material and made us who we were when we were born. And we had certain dispositions and inclinations. They call it epigenetics, which we don't have time to get into. But we wanted to express what our parent material made of us. And that's what we wanted to do. That's the way we wanted to think. That's the way we wanted to behave and everything. And so we all have parent material, and that parent material, unfortunately, we all start with some deformity. We start with some imbalances and incompleteness. And we need to resist the idea of self-expression. We need to realize that there are things about ourselves that, you know, are not in balance and not complete. So you have that reality, and if that's, depending on where you live, that's a reality you're not going to change. I have people ask me all the time, well, can I just bring in different soil? Can I just bring in different materials? And yes, you can do that, but you're just bringing a different set of problems to address. So you can either address the issues with what you have, or you can address the issues with what you're going to get, but you're still going to have issues to address. And so I just choose to deal with the stuff that I already have and improve it. You can have environmental influences, and we'll talk about this when we go to that topic later. But the amount of rainfall that you have, the temperatures that you have, all of these things affect, you know, how much weed pressure you're actually going to have, and we'll just leave that at that for right now. And then the big ones that I want to talk about are incomplete and/or imbalanced mineralization. Your character's not right. And we look at these plants when they grow, we call them weeds. We look at them as weeds, but they're growing because of the conditions. And they're telling you, and believe it or not, nature is actually trying to fix what's wrong. By allowing these plants to grow here, they have the ability to extract particular nutrients that might be in excess, are deficient. And they're trying to extract those. Dandelion is one that people probably know, everybody knows dandelion, is one that is tapping into calcium that's leached way too far down into the soil and bringing it back to the surface. And if it was given enough time, depending on the overall chemistry of the soil, given enough time, dandelion would actually eventually put itself out of business and would disappear on its own once it recovered enough calcium and brought it back up to the surface. Now that's assuming that there's adequate calcium down there to get, and that's not always the case. And the same thing is true with most weeds. Anybody have a problem with Canada thistle? Must come from Canada because they call it Canada thistle. Malo asked me if he, I guess, heard a story that I shared, so I'll share this story since we're on the weeds. Canada thistle grows and there's books written on this. You can go and you can read these books, and they will give you an insight into why certain plants are there. And so this is one of the ways, you know, absent a soil test, you can tell, well, I'm dealing with these conditions in my soil. Now, you can't be very precise about addressing them, but you can address them in a general sense as a result of it. But Canada thistle grows where calcium is low, the soil is tight, and that's because there's high potassium, high magnesium. We, in a state that I used to live in, I have to be careful what I say, determined that they had a major Canada thistle problem, and they determined that they were going to eradicate Canada thistle from the state. And they initiated a statewide program to eradicate Canada thistle by spraying an herbicide on it. And they sprayed essentially the whole state and declared that they had eradicated Canada thistle from the state until the next spring, when it all came back. Problem is, they didn't change the conditions that was allowing that Canada thistle to proliferate. The story that he was asking me to talk about is two ranches or two big dairies. They were two big dairies in Australia. 1,000 acres, 2,000 acres, I can't remember the size. They were big. And both of them had a problem with Canada thistle. And the one owner decided to try to eradicate it the same way I shared with you and was not successful and got frustrated with that. And there was this one Canada thistle in particular that would grow right by the doorstep of his house, like it was mocking him. And he had one of his hired hands dig it out, and it came back. And he had to dig it out again, deeper, and it came back. And he had to dig it out even deeper. He poured kerosene on it and put a can over the spot. And guess what happened? It came back. This is a battle you will not win. If you do not change the conditions, the plant that's proliferating will continue to proliferate. Now, the neighbor who learned about the modeling that I'm talking about and decided that he would try that to eliminate the Canada thistle. And within 3 years, the Canada thistle left on its own. He never sprayed any herbicide. There were Canada thistle seeds blowing onto his property from the neighbor who still had the Canada thistle. And within 3 years, like I said, the Canada thistle just disappeared. Now, were the seeds still there? Yeah. But the conditions were changed. So they increased the calcium levels, they improved the soil structure in that soil, and there was adequate calcium available. And the Canada thistle couldn't compete with other plants anymore successfully. So it just simply went away. And this is the most important thing I want you to learn about dealing with weeds. There's some other things we're going to talk about. So it's incomplete and imbalanced mineralization. And it results in the next thing, which is inappropriate porosity and or capillarity in your soil. Your soil does not have the structure that it needs in order to be able to breathe and to have water move in and out. And some certain plants, in particular the plants we plant to grow as productive crops, cannot grow very well in poor structured soils. But these other plants can. They have a root. Bindweed is another one. It looks like morning glory. I would call it bindweed, but the flowers, it's like in the morning glory family. Does anybody have those? If you've ever dug out bindweed, we had another problem because of the parent material in ours, where we were there. And you follow a bindweed root down, it'll go this way, and then this way, and then this way, and then over this way, and everything. But it'll punch its way through solid soil. And it's going down deep again to get nutrients, particularly calcium, that is inadequate in the top soil. And there's a reason that soil is so hard. It's because there's not enough calcium there, which we're going to get to. But even though, it's interesting, even though this neighbor eliminated his thistle problem by simply changing the conditions and improving his soil structure and his chemistry, the neighbor wouldn't do it. And in fact, I've heard this before. Remember I was talking about the fellow in Illinois who had the highest yield he'd ever had in that drought situation where everybody else has died? You know what he was accused of? Witchcraft. He was able to do that from witchcraft. Must be the devil that allowed him to do that. So I'm just sharing that so you know when your garden is growing beautiful and everything, be sure you share it with your neighbors because you want to impact them with it before they get the idea that you're practicing witchcraft on it. So it simply comes... Okay, the comment was that, and I'm going to get to that, all weeds actually are helpful. The problem is we don't eat them because they're really not what we're supposed to be eating. But these weeds are messengers. They are. And so probably weeds you're thinking about are like, they're weeds of fertility, like pigweed, redroot pigweed, and lamb's quarters. Those are fertility weeds where you have good fertility. The problem is you have too much soluble fertility. You have too many nutrients in soluble form. And you don't want nutrients in soluble form. You want them insoluble but available. In other words, so the plant or the microbe in the soil has access to them, but they're not in solution, because if it rains, what happens to something in solution? It washes away. And so they are fertility weeds because you've got a lot of fertility there. And if you eat lamb's quarters, you're going to get pretty good nutrition out of it. But it's also indicating to you that you've overdone it, that you have too much soluble nutrition in your system. So, well, yeah, time of trouble food, certainly they're nutritious. In fact, a lot of these weeds, if you ate them, this is where herbal therapy came from, by the way, is people would wildcraft plants that they had discovered. You know, a lot of people died trying some things. So we forget about that part. But, you know, trial and error, people discovered that certain plants would give them certain health benefits if they weren't feeling well. Like, you know, we could go through a whole bunch of them and everything, but some of them, I'm sure some of you are familiar with what I'm talking about here. One of the dilemmas with that is, and it's simply because the plant had the ability to extract certain nutrients out of the soil, which in that area, so anybody eating food grown in that area would be probably deficient in and would cause problems for them. And so if they use these herbs as a therapeutic, it would help them with that nourishment. It was actually with nourishment. You have things like willow bark, of course, which has salicylic acid in it, which is aspirin. So So, you know, if you want a natural painkiller, you have willow trees, the bark you can get from that. Anyway, we could mention a lot of them. One of the things that happened, though, unfortunately, in modern herbal therapy is that once we discovered that these plants had these compounds in them, we domesticated them. And we started growing them because the demand for the herb increased, and we started domesticating them and growing them on soil that was not what the plant was used to growing in. And they started producing extracts that were not doing the same thing that the wildcrafted herbs had done. Now, you can grow it on really fertile soil, and you can grow plants we call weeds. You can grow them on a really fertile soil if you cultivate them. And you can actually benefit from those compounds that they concentrate if it's grown on a really fertile soil. Or wildcrafted herbs, but a lot of people are disappointed when the herbs don't really give them the benefit that they were hoping that it would, that historically it had given them, because it's been grown on domesticated soils now to produce larger volumes of it to be able to market. So if you know of those plants and you want to grow them, then make sure you grow them on, either wildcraft them because they're able to get what they need in those particular soils. They're probably not good soils. They're just soils that actually have, that this plant has the ability to get what it needs out of them, and other plants just couldn't get it out. So the big thing is these two things: you have incomplete and you have imbalanced mineralization that is causing particular plants, we call weeds, to grow and outcompete your preferred growth, the plants you prefer to grow, which are your fruits and vegetables. They're going to outcompete them because they can, if you have poor soil chemistry, which is going to result also in poor porosity or poor structuring of that soil, these plants can grow there a lot easier because they have the ability to extract nutrients that are very difficult to find and get, whereas the other plants, just don't have the ability to do that. And so if you're looking at weeds and how to address them, then whatever else you're doing as far as cultivation is, and which is necessary, and I'll talk about that in just a second here, the biggest thing you can do to change the weed pressure that you're dealing with is to change the conditions in your soil. If you just develop proper structure, which is a result of proper chemistry, then you will eliminate that pressure and it'll make your cultivating of weeds, plants out. I don't like calling them weeds because, there's a purpose for them. The same thing with the insects and the diseases that come along. They're resorting to what nature tells them is the alternative to resort to. And they're simply telling you, like a messenger would, what the realities are for it. But if you want to eliminate those things from doing harm to your productive crop, then you have to change the conditions. And that's the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different outcomes. It won't happen. And if you continue to do the same thing over and over, you'll continue to have the same problems. And unfortunately, you not only will continue to have the same problems, your problems will increase because it's continuing to deteriorate. The earth is waxing old. That's what the Bible says. The earth is waxing old and is groaning under the curse. The curse that man brought on. Not that God brought on, but the curse that man brought on to the earth. And our poor stewardship of the thing that we're made of. We're made from the dust. And God gave us dominion over what we were made of to properly steward it. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. But it's possible. Let me say this. It's possible to impart the right condition to it. I think somebody asked me this question before, and I don't know if I answered it from up here. By the time I get a day or two in, I can't remember who I was talking to outside of the meeting and what I was saying in the meeting. But things will continue to deteriorate, but you can impart a better condition to them. That better condition will not stand perpetually. We could talk about the parable of the sower here, and there are people, and it parallels my experience with individuals and growers perfectly. You have people out there that hear this, what I'm sharing here, and they're off and gone before they even consider it. You have people who consider it, but they're really not. They want something that's a one-time, we're done. And it fixes everything perpetually, and I'll never have to do another thing again. And if it doesn't do that, they're off trying to find the next magic solution. You have people who, and at some level or another, you can relate to every one of these, but this next one, all of us, I think, can relate to. You have people who are sincere, well-intentioned, and the things of life just keep you tangled up and tied up, and you don't. Remember I was sharing about those 2 black raspberry patches? One got done what needed to get done, and the other just got tied up with all this stuff going on, didn't get it done, and he wound up losing the crop as a result of that. And that is a challenge for all of us, particularly if you're trying to move to the country and deal with all the things you have to deal with, to try to get all that in order and working well for you. So I don't discount that or diminish that at all. We all have to face that. And so I was actually listening to a presentation by Jean-Martin Fortier, who's over here in Quebec, talking about a couple who had started farming a couple years before and just got overwhelmed and came to him and said, "We can't do it. We're quitting." And everything. And he said what I'd shared with you is that, if you're going through hell, keep going. You'll eventually, but know that you're doing the right thing and just continue to search for, why is this happening? What do I need to do differently than what I'm doing? Because if you keep doing the same thing over and over and it's just not working. I had a university person one time. I do a lot of work with blueberry growers, and we don't grow blueberries the way they tell you to grow blueberries, because the best blueberries don't grow that way. But he didn't think I knew what I was talking about, and yet he had planted blueberries 3 times, and all 3 times they had died. He had never been successful getting them to grow. And every one of the growers I had growing blueberries, the way I know to grow them, were doing fantastic. The highest yields and the highest quality does not come from growing. If any of you know anything about blueberries, they tell you to grow it on acid soil. And that's simply not true. Now, most blueberries are grown that way, and there are methods, techniques that they use to make sure that they keep growing. But a lot of times they'll tell you that the blueberry plants will peter out. They'll kind of continue to deteriorate, and then every 10 years or so you're going to have to plant new plants or whatever. I talked to a grower in Oregon who had blueberry plants that were 100 years old. They were on a generational family farm, and they were 100 years old. And they had to move them because they were apparently selling part of the property, and they didn't want to lose the blueberries. And so they'll also tell you that blueberries have this little root system, and it's very fragile. Well, the blueberry root system in typical growing conditions is pretty fragile. But his blueberry roots, they had to bring a tree spade in to take them out, to take his blueberry plants out. That's how massive his root system was on those 100-year-old blueberries. So I don't remember why I was telling that story, but the older you get, sometimes you start thinking, what in the world did I got to come up? But anyway, it comes back to conditions. You have to have the right conditions. You have to know what those conditions are supposed to be. If you can't measure something, you can't manage it. Now, it depends on how you're able to measure it, but you need to be able to measure something, and you need to have confidence in the way they're measuring it and what the reference is to that measurement in order to make things work. And we're going to talk about when we get to external influences. So if you don't mind waiting till then, we'll talk about that. What you're being told about a lot of things is just simply not true. But the earth is waxing old like a garment. And what you're seeing happen is increased instability. Nature wants to try to maintain stability. Now, I will just share one thing since it was brought up and it came to my mind, in case I don't say it before. All the drought that we've had out west in the U.S., did Canada have that out west too, but the drought? But, a multi-year drought out there, things were really bad and everything. But nature is always eventually going to, bring things back to balance, to stability. And so what we saw, and usually the farther out of a balance it gets, the spring back or the return overshoots. And so in California in particular this year, we had all these reservoirs out west. They were just about going dry, and everybody was panicking. What are we going to do? And first of all, they had made a lot of assumptions that just weren't accurate with reality. But in 1 year, everything is refilled. And in fact, they're spilling water out of reservoirs that they haven't spilled water out of in 25, 30 years. They had too much water. They had farm fields being flooded and everything else. So nature is always going to try to bring things back to balance on it. But the farther out we get out of balance, the more you want to swing this way. And, if you want to know reality in society right now, I don't know how you guys feel about it, but the culture seems to be losing its mind. And just indulging in everything you can imagine. Well, there's going to be a spring back from that. There's going to be a bounce back. And unfortunately, it's going to go too far back to the right. And that, most likely, that's when we're going to start seeing. And this is because we have a wrong-headed idea about how God deals with sin and how he deals with these conditions. And so we think that, violence, God never violates anybody. But the use of violence and force to enforce fantasies, lies, that are just simply not the reason why things are the way they are on it. So, coming back to emphasizing the point, there is a way to do things the right way. The question is to discover what that right way is. God said to go to the earth and let it teach you. He made the earth. And I'll even assert this about the Bible. You can come to the wrong conclusions. I mean, how many church denominations are there? You can come to the wrong conclusions about a lot of things reading the Bible. You can go to the earth and you can come to a lot of conclusions about what you discover there that are not correct because you're assuming things that are just simply not true. But there is a way. God wants us to prosper. He wants us to be blessed. And so we have to believe that, and we have to pursue knowledge. And when this statement that I was told a long time ago, and I can't remember who said it, was that when the student's ready, the teacher will come. Remember I said that God had convinced me that I needed to be a farmer and not a doctor, and not to follow the standard path to learn agronomy and soil science and all those things. Not that a lot of that knowledge is not relevant, but you also learn a lot of knowledge that steers you down a wrong path. And unfortunately, it's unfortunate to say that a lot of times you have to satisfy vested interests rather than the truth. And I've talked to university people multiple times in private, and they'll say in private what they will not say in public, because if they said it publicly, they'd lose their job. And so just because a quote expert tells you something, or authorities tell you something, that doesn't mean it has anything to do with anything near the truth. It has to do with the way they want reality to be, which is not the way reality is. Anyway, we better get back to the material here. But this relates to this too. And it makes it hard for you. I always talk about you will exhaust everything that you have to to follow the Lamb wherever he goes. You will. But you won't care. You'll get to the point, and I hope I reinforce that on Sabbath with what I'm going to talk about. But it won't matter to you. You'll be like those salmon that swim up those rivers and streams and go through pipes and every insane thing you can imagine to try to get back to their spawning ground to preserve life. That's the way you and I will be. Following that Lamb wherever he goes is our only objective. Knowing that in doing so, we are doing the best for ourselves, and we're doing the best for every other person that we might have any influence or contact with in doing that. But it's hard. It's hard. Do we ever honestly look at Jesus' life? How easy did he have it? He was with his people. And, it wasn't easy. Okay, so we've talked about the insects and the diseases, and we've talked about the weeds, and I hope I've given you a different understanding about how to address those things. Now, I did mention, I should go back to that. Those 1,000,000 weed seeds, they're there. They're going to want to germinate. The more fertility you put in there, the more they're going to want to germinate. But the difference is, one, you go out and you cultivate. What does that mean? They're coming, and you've planted your crop. They're coming, and you're going to go out there and you're going to cultivate when they're in that little white root stage. And you're going to knock it down. And you're going to give the plants that you planted. Hopefully you're following all these things where you're changing the conditions and you're proving the opportunity and the possibility of that plant prospering. And you're giving that chance for that plant to grow and, canopy the soil. And once it canopies the soil, any other weed seeds there, if you don't disturb that soil, if you can cultivate what's closest to the surface to germinate, and the plants canopy the soil, then you're going to eliminate the pressure from weeds after that on it. There's other techniques that you can use, but by doing that. Now, I'll tell you another thing that happens when you change the conditions in your soil. There are compounds that plants produce that suppress germination. In other words, the plants are suppressing competition around them, and so they'll exude these compounds into the soil to suppress these seeds that we call weed seeds in the soil, whatever seeds are there, to suppress them from germinating. In typical soil, that effect only lasts for a few days. In a healthy soil, that effect can last for a few weeks. So that gives you one more advantage to the plant helps suppress the germination of those seeds itself. And it gives it a long enough time frame so that plant can grow enough and canopy that soil and block light from allowing and helping those plants to grow. And even if they germinate under there, they can't get enough light and they'll eventually die even after they germinated. And over time, you can reduce that population there. This is another reason when we talk about disturbance of the soil, every time you till a soil and you till it 6-8 inches deep, you're bringing more seeds up close to the surface. Now, it may even be necessary to do that. So this is why you want to be doing all of these things to create the conditions, though, even though I have to do tillage of that soil, and I know I'm bringing more weed seeds up there, then I have all these other things that are in my favor. I recognize that they're there. I'm going to do the cultivation when it's necessary. I've tried to improve the structuring of that soil and the mineralization of that soil. You're getting all those things to work for you in spite of that. If you do not allow things to go to seed, that seed bank will begin to diminish. And another thing that will happen is, actually, the healthier the soil gets, the microbes in the soil start destroying those seeds in the soil. Start breaking them down, eating them, consuming them. And so, getting from where you are to that place, I've been there. I know what it's like, but I also know what it's like getting there. And so, like I said, it can be a battle, But here and again, it's you want to be sure that everything that you're doing, all of that effort that you're putting in, all of the resources you're putting in, there's nothing worse than planting a garden. You till it up, you plant it, you do your cultivation, but you just can't seem to, or you can't seem to get ahead of the weeds, or you have so many other things you need to do. You get behind with that. The chemistry's not really right, and you're not really aware of that it's not right, or you're working on that, but it's not quite there. I told someone this morning, Vaughn, that you have to expect 3 to 5 years to get to a good place. Sometimes there's factors that will affect that. We have materials that are finer grind now, like liming materials, calcium and magnesium materials, that can break down in 6 months to a year, whereas typically it would take 2 to 3 years for that full breakdown to happen. So, but it costs more. And so I know growers that just simply couldn't afford to do everything they really needed to do. It was going to take a lot. And so it took them a long time, just simply because they could only do so much each year to get there. But it's 3 to 5 years, and I've personally made mistakes, and I know other growers have made a mistake. I did it because I was trying to discover something. But the cost of that mistake took me 3 years to straighten out. Now, I knew I made a mistake, and I knew it was happening, so I could do some foliar things and things like that to offset the problem that I created. But the important thing, I don't suggest other growers do that. I'm doing that for you. But you want your resources to return an investment to you. You want to see the fruits of your labor. And I tell growers, I'll just share this again now because I may forget to later, to start at a scale that you really believe you have the ability to start at. I have lots of growers who just, they take off and they just plant all this stuff and everything, and I just know. I have 30 years of experience with this. I know they're going to get overwhelmed. It's just too much, and they're not able, just simply not able. Not that they don't desire to be, but they're simply not going to be able to keep up with that. And so they become, things fall apart, they get discouraged, and every time that happens, it's more likely you're just going to give up when it happens. But if you start small and you do everything you know to do, and you have a success, well then you have increased motivation and desire to continue on and to do more. So I always encourage people, don't get carried away with what you're doing, because it's probably not going to turn out well for you. Now, there are exceptions to that, but the vast majority of the time, it just doesn't turn out well because you're trying to take on too much. And I understand, because I've done that a long time ago, and I also understand people's motivation. Well, I want fruit, tree fruit, and I want cane fruit, and I want all these fruits and vegetables and everything, and I do too. And we actually had, I think I have a couple pictures of it. I don't think it's in, I think my wife sent one picture of a stray raspberry plant that we had. We had a half-acre greenhouse in Colorado, and we had dwarf fruit trees, and we had seedless table grapes, and we had blueberries, and we had strawberries, and we had, well, those are all the perennials, I think. Oh, no, we had gooseberries in there, and I'm not remembering all of them. But then we had produce growing, annual crops growing in and among that. And that was, in that situation, I had to learn something new. God always takes me to these places where He has to teach me something I didn't know, and everything. We had to deal with an issue there. But I think there's one picture of it. It's fantastic to walk into a place like that, and you can just, and I was talking to somebody, we were talking about how it's nice to have seasonality. And we need to learn how to eat with the seasons a little bit more because, if you've eaten something, you start getting something in, you haven't had it for a whole year fresh, and you're just looking forward to it. And you start getting it, and you eat it, and you eat it, and you eat it, and pretty soon you're like, we have anything else in the garden? especially if you planted more than what you can eat yourself or preserve. But it's always sharing it. But it was nice to have different things coming in at different parts of the season where we could just when you're about ready to say, well, even though you still like things, you're about ready, I'm ready for something else. And, but we had this, I'll just tell the story. We had this raspberry plant that we had an extra raspberry plant. It was a golden raspberry. And we planted it in a grow bag and just put it in a grow bag and just set it to the side along the wall of and I have a picture, you'll see this picture later. And that raspberry, it was from the soil. We were having problems with our soil in there and growth because of the water quality. And we're going to talk about that. But it didn't have anything to do with the soil fertility I was doing. It was messing up the soil fertility I was doing. And let me just put it this way. I would much rather deal with somebody with the right spirit and the wrong knowledge than somebody with the wrong spirit and the right knowledge. It works a whole lot better. So you're going to get a whole lot further. Anyway, but we were dealing with that wrong spirit with the right knowledge. It wasn't my wrong spirit, it was that water that had issues that I had to discover and learn about. But this raspberry plant wasn't getting that water. It was just getting condensation moisture from the side of the greenhouse, watering it. So it had the fertility that we had done in there. And we were at 7,000 feet in elevation, and 300 days of sunshine. So we had a lot of solar intensity. And we'll get to this with the external influences, but we had too much sunlight. Do you know you could have too much sunlight? There's a spirit of prophecy quote about that talks about too much sunlight and a few other things. Well, yeah, we don't have too much sunlight where we are now, but we had too much sunlight. Plants need about 3,000 to 4,000 foot candles of light to grow well, and we had 10,000 on a daily basis, in the summertime especially. We'd have 10,000 foot candles of light. So in the greenhouse, the plastic diffused that light and reduced it a little bit, so the plants actually grew better in the greenhouse than they did outside because we were able to, and we had really low humidity, so we were able to modify the humidity level a little bit that helped the plants. But this raspberry plant grew, it finally was 16 feet tall. You ever seen a raspberry plant 16 feet tall? The bottom of the cane was about 1.5 inches in diameter. And we picked, I don't know how many quarts of raspberries off of that thing. One plant. So I share that story because, the fertility was right. It was the water that was causing problems. So the rest of our raspberries, until we got that straightened out, they were anything like that. But this one separate plant, I think it was 12 feet tall with the picture I'm going to show you. It was already at 12 feet at that point. But what God has in store for us is a lot more than we ever imagined if we can create the conditions. Now, we do have environmental influences that we have to deal with that can be a problem for that. But okay, anyway, but you get the idea with the diseases and the insects and the weeds. The conditions are favorable for them to send you a message that things are not right. And when you change those conditions, they will no longer come to tell you that you have a problem. Don't kill the messengers. Listen to what they had to say. Yep, sometimes they come different times of the season. That's because of environmental influences or their own life cycle. Like, yeah, well, that's one way to avoid it. If you can plant, out of their life cycle. Not everybody can do that, but if you can do that, you can avoid their life cycle. Like Japanese beetles where we are. Do you guys have Japanese beetles up here? They usually show up around us early to mid-June, and then they're usually around till August, something like that. So I know they're coming, and we don't have all of our areas, so sometimes you can have environmental stresses that bring your plants below the threshold that they should be at and everything, and so they become vulnerable and everything. So, but I know they're coming, so I have my traps set out, and I'm making sure that the plants are as healthy as possible and everything, and we get minimal damage from them. But I know when they come, so if I can plant, and you can't always do it, but if you could plant something before they're going to hatch and come out, then you could do that. Or afterwards, they're pretty much gone by August, and if you could do it after that. But that's just an illustration of what you were talking about. Okay. I put this slide on here. Just there's a lot that could be talked about in this slide, but I want to show the difference. Regenerative Ag focuses on trying to encourage microbes in the soil and structuring your soil through microbes, and it's a good process. It should be included in what you're doing, but it should be included along with addressing the chemistry of your soil, not just addressing the biology. In fact, I think that addressing the chemistry affects the physics, or in other words, the structure of the soil, and by the time you have good chemistry there and you have good physics, you've created a house and a nutritional source for the microbes that are already there in your soil. People want to put all kinds of microbes on, but you'd be surprised how many are already there. They're just dormant. The conditions are not right for them to function. And so once you get those conditions, all of a sudden you'll see things show up that you didn't even know were there. And that biology now has the ability to proliferate on its own. And you don't have to spend money. A lot of times you spend money, it's not always true, but you spend money on bioinoculants. In other words, you're putting biology in, and sometimes that's a valuable thing. I don't want to discount it completely, but they just get eaten up by the microbes that are there. And you just spend all that money on them, and you don't get a whole lot of benefit from it. Now, some of the reasons they do it, I'll save that for the biology part of it. Anyway, this is just a graph that was done by Dr. Olivier Hassan in part of his presentation on oxidation reduction, which we're going to get to next. A few slides next. And it's comparing what balanced soil, which is all the way to the left, the productivity of balanced soil, and then the next column is unbalanced soil using foliar nutrition to address the imbalances. And then the next one is, and it produces high photosynthesis both ways. And the next one is limited photosynthesis from unbalanced soil and stresses, where you don't have balanced soil, you're not doing foliar nutrition to try to address some of those problems. And as you go across there, you see that productivity diminishes. It goes down. And if you look all the way over to the left, the balanced soil has a healthy plant and balanced plant. And you have high soil input. So if you're trying to build your soil fertility, having healthy soil to start with feeds on making it even healthier and making it even more balanced. And so in every one of these categories, which is reproduction, which is up in the blue part of the column, shoots, which is the vegetative part of the plant, is the light green there, overall health is the red, and then root production and what they're calling rhizodeposition, which is simply the plant dumping photosynthase energy into the soil, which we'll talk about when we get to the carbon fertility. You see the bar is wider on the balanced soil? It is actually a balanced soil is the most productive in all of those areas. It is the most productive. You can use what regenerative ag uses, using foliar applications and biology to do that, but it's not as productive. And then, of course, if you're not doing anything, you wind up in these other two areas where you have, you see that one over there all the way to the right where the red, the health, overall health is better than the next one over to the left of it, because the plant is now kicking in a lot of energy into its immune system to try to protect itself. And so, but it's barely hanging on there. So there's a lot of detail you could go into on that, but I put that up there to show you that a healthy, balanced soil is going to give you the greatest production and the greatest health in your system. You can utilize this other one, but I think it makes no sense when we know that we can use balancing the chemistry in the soil and add that with the use of biology and foliars if we need to deal with significant deficiencies or whatever that you can't address all at once. And like I said, it takes about 3 to 5 years because there are some things you have to get your major elements balanced before you can even really start addressing significantly your trace elements. And the real difference comes with those trace elements. When you bring those trace elements up to the levels that they can be at once the major elements are balanced, in particular I talk about calcium, which we're going to get to, you see things happen that are unbelievable. Productivity goes up, the health of those plants go up, and the quality of the stuff that you start eating just blows your mind. And if you want people to eat better, give them something worth eating. I believe that people would eat healthier if they had something healthier to eat. And so if you can do that and you take it, and like you guys are mostly gardeners, but I mostly talk to, I do talk to gardeners, but a lot of who I talk to are growers and everything. They're going to the market. And you capture a clientele. Once you get your soil so it's really healthy, the produce you're producing has so much impact on those people. I had one guy tell us, there's a brief one, he would buy 20 pounds of tomatoes a week from us, 20 pounds. And he said, I can't really afford to do it. This is way back, it was $2 a pound then. But he said, I can't really afford to do it, but I can't live without your tomatoes. And I said, well, I just grinned at him. I said, well, if you're going to buy 20 pounds, I'll give you a better price. And not only was he happy with being able to get the tomatoes, but he was happy that I actually was, trying to be considerate and mindful of his financial condition and everything. Again, these things pop into my mind. I just share them when they come because they may not come before. Where I live in Kentucky, most of the people are really poor. They can't afford to buy at Whole Foods or some health food store where you have to spend a lot more money for those foods, which you would hope are better for you, but there's no guarantee. So one of the other reasons, and I usually share it in the Grower's Purpose, which we're going to talk about Friday night, Saturday night. So what I do is I say, if I can, like the average commercial yield of potatoes, growing potatoes, what do you think it is per plant? How many pounds of potatoes do you think are produced per plant in commercial production? Per plant, how many pounds do you think? 20 pounds, 15? Wow, you guys are optimistic. Yep, he's got it. 2 pounds. Commercial yield. You know what the world record is per plant? 100 pounds. 100 pounds. Now, there's specific things you have to do that, and you can, but what if you could just get 5 pounds instead of 2? Can you sell it for less and still be profitable? You have to be profitable. If you're not profitable, you're going to go out of business, or you're just not going to be able to do something. So if you could increase your production, so I can't, you go into big cities and everything like that, and farmers markets and places like that, and they charge big money for what they sell, and it's probably worth it. I don't know always, but it's probably worth it. Everything, because we're paying way too little for what we're we're paying what we should for what we're getting, but for what we need, it would cost us more to do that. But what about the people? If I'm doing this as a ministry, not just to feed myself, I'm doing this as a ministry to help others. What do I need to do so that those people who don't have the money can afford nourishment? and I can bring them along to a better place as well. We need to take that into consideration. I'm going to talk more about this on Sabbath, but that's possible to do. We had an issue in Colorado. The reason we left Colorado, all of my kids were born there. We lived there for 20 years and everything. We didn't want to leave, but we had an issue with water. And I won't share all of it. I'm here to take the time and everything. But I was not allowed to sell. I was told I could grow whatever I wanted to grow, but I could not sell it. And so, well, there's more to the story, but I won't take the time to do it. But I grew produce for 2 years without the ability to sell it and gave it away to people who needed it. Because, you know, it was despite them, if you want to be honest about my, you know, human nature, it was despite them that I'm going to do it, you know. And I was legally in the right. I should have had the legal right to be able to sell it, but I gave it away and everything, and people just couldn't. What are you doing? You can't do that. No. I said, well, I can either spend tens of thousands of dollars fighting the state, or I can spend a few $1,000s feeding people. Amen. And we you know, ultimately had to leave because of the, you know, the circumstances and everything, and that's how we find ourselves in Kentucky. But we have to think about more than just ourselves. What are we doing all this for? Is it just so we don't have to deal with the hassles of living in the city? We don't have to deal with all the difficulties and all the challenges. When you got enough difficulties moving out into the country, you better have good reasons for, good motivation for doing it. It can be a lot better than people experience, though. A lot better than people experience. And so that's why I'm here sharing this stuff with you, so that you can have this opportunity to make that part of it better for you. And if it's better for you, then you become more motivated. You become more, you know, embracing. You embrace it more. And then you become more motivated about others. Boy, this is doing for me. I want to tell somebody else about it. I want to share it with them. And like I said before, it doesn't matter how you enter into a person's life. If you bring nourishment with you, you will change that person's life. And they will want even more. They want to know even more. Okay, so you see that I deviate from my slides here quite a bit. And so I apologize. We may not get through everything, but you will get what's worthwhile information with what we do wind up getting through. So we're done the first section. It's supposed to have taken 2 hours. If you would like, I can take some questions right now, or I can continue on to the next one. Okay. Okay. Or maybe I can save a little bit of time. I'll try to save a little bit of time. Well, we have 30 minutes. Okay. So, all right, just give me a second here because I got to switch to the. Oops, went to the wrong one. Went right back to the one I was. Okay. So what we have to do, we need to start taking a dive into the actual chemistry that I've been mentioning multiple times. But we need to define some terms and characteristics so you kind of understand what I'm talking about when I say them. But before we get to that, Christ's Object Lessons, page 43, it says, that with which the parable of the sower chiefly deals is the effect produced on the seed by the soil into which it's cast. And so, again, what we're talking about here is character. It's what happens to that seed once that seed has a little seed, package of nutrition in it, but once it germinates and puts its roots out, it has to make that connection with that soil, and that soil has to nourish it. And so there's a relationship there. We want to make sure that that relationship actually results in a yield of 30, 60, or 100-fold. You know there's a scientific reason for why Jesus said that? I'll share it later if I remember. The healthier your soil gets, the more it produces. I mean, that's the short version of it. It's simply, it's the parable of the talents too, where you can multiply the talents. Or you can say, well, I just really don't have anything to offer. Or my master is unreasonable and unbearable, and so I'm not going to do anything with it. Okay, so here's some of these terms that we need to understand. Soil texture. So your soil is made up of, remember that pie chart, and it said mineral, and it's basically made up of sand, silt, and clay, or the different size materials, how they define them. And we'll look at a little bit more of those as we go along. This is, and unfortunately, I don't know if it's going to be enough for us to really see it. This is some soil that I got from Vaughn this morning. Vaughn. I don't know your last name, I'm sorry. Samuels. So what I'm doing is a jar test, which you can do if you want to know what your texture of your soil is. You just take an amount of it. It probably should have been about 3 times as much soil as I had, so you can really get a visual of it. But you can look at this later. It's going to take, it'll probably be by this afternoon. I shook this, and what will happen is the heavier particles are the bigger, heavier particles, which are the sand particle, what was defined as sand. Sand is a certain size soil particle. So it's not like white beach sand or black beach sand you've seen black. It's a certain size particle. And then the next layer that'll settle out will be what's called silt, which is just a smaller size mineral particle or rock particle in your soil. And then the last thing that settle out is most of what's sitting up in that water is clay. Now some of that's, how much of that settles out is going to tell me a lot about some of the chemistry in there. But once it all settles out, you can take and measure the total height of the column, and then measure the thickness of each of those layers, and you can get a percentage of what percent is sand, what percent is silt, and what percent is clay. And then you can go to a chart, which I have on the next page. It doesn't matter as long as you, normally I would have this thing about that full with dirt. It's just a matter of you can see it easier if you've got a higher thickness. You can just see the divisions. Because this is it's only going to wind up being like down here. It's going to be a little bit harder because of the curve in the jar. If I had a beaker, which I didn't bring with me, I should have. If I had a beaker with a flat bottom, straight flat bottom, you can see a lot easier in there. But you can still look at it and you'll see the separation in there, because the heaviest stuff will fall out first, the next heaviest stuff will fall out, and then the lightest stuff will fall out. And then you'll have some organic material that'll stay up. Most of that'll be floating on the surface here. But how clear this gets is going to tell me something about how well that soil can structure, which is the next thing we're going to define. So this is what your soil is. It doesn't tell you anything as far as its texture. It doesn't tell you anything about the actual mineralization, what minerals are in all of that and everything. But it's a thing you can do on your own, just taking a jar, putting a bunch of soil in there, and then fill it with water, shake it really good. Oh, shouldn't have done that because it's going to... and then you can go back and you can see what texture of soil you have. You're not going to change that. The texture of your soil. That's what you have. That's what the parent material is. But you can change what I'm going to define next, which is the texture of that soil. And basically what I'm saying is, how do we get the pore space in that soil? How do all those parts, the big ones and the little ones and the tiny ones, all come together to create pore space in your soil? That's soil structure. And there's a specific soil structure that you want. You want that 50% of that volume to be pore space. But you want it to be certain size pores. And you want it, again, half of that filled with water. And as we go along, you're going to see why some of the reason for some of these things. Has anybody heard of biochar? Okay, one of the reasons that biochar is so effective is, one, because it has a charge to it. But the other reason is its pore size. It's like optimum pore size, and microbes love it. And then you can also attach nutrients to it. I have very different experiences and very different stories about people's experiences with biochar. One of the dilemmas is people will put biochar on that they've made, and it just grabs chemistry out of the soil and ties stuff up. It changes the balance in the soil. And so it actually winds up creating a problem for some people. Some people put it on, and because of the way they have things, tying some things up was a good thing, and all of a sudden they get fantastic results as a result of that. And you are providing increased capacity in that soil by putting the biochar on. Okay, so the question was, if you had that condition like where you had too much fertility available there, like where lamb's quarters and red root pigweed was growing, if you put biochar on, would it help that situation? Most likely, yes, it would, because it would take those soluble nutrients and, grab onto them, like we're going to talk about with exchange capacity. It just grabs on to and holds. It takes them out of solubility and into insolubility, but they're still available. They're still available to the plant. Sometimes people produce biochar and there winds up being a lot of sodium in that biochar. So what I'm saying to you is we could talk about, I have people that doubled and tripled yields by putting the biochar in there when they were composting. They included the biochar is where you take and you essentially burn wood with absent of oxygen. And charcoal would be the best. Activated charcoal would be another way of describing it, yeah. No, it's not the same as ash from your burning wood. It's not the same on it. You can look it up, and you can learn a lot about it just looking it up on biochar. But there's mixed results with it, and it simply comes down to what is the material that you produce the biochar from, what are the conditions you're putting it into. Like I said, I had one grower that put biochar in with his compost, and I don't remember how much he put in when he was doing his compost, and when he put his compost on, he went from producing about, with sweet potatoes, and he went from producing about 4 nice-sized sweet potatoes to 24 nice-sized sweet potato tubers. That was a pretty good result. Now, nobody knows the long term, how long will that effect last? Biochar is pretty durable, and so it can stick around for a long time, but I think there's a lot of factors that aren't really quite completely understood with all of that. So we're going to actually talk about biochar a little bit more. We may not need to now when we get to carbon fertility. So this is soil texture. This is what you have. Now you know, okay, how's it put together? How is it structured in my soil? And if you guys were building a house, you moved to the country, you're building a house, and you built a house and the ceilings are only 4 feet tall, how's that well going to work out for you? Unless you're 3 feet tall. You'll have a hard time. So the illustration being, I did some work in Japan a few years back, and I stayed at an older home, older Japanese home. And the doorway's height, I'm 6'5", and the doorway heights were well below 6'5". And I came back from Japan with more scar tissue on my head. Point being is you want that soil structured in an ideal way, in an optimum way, so that you can maximize. And a lot of people say you want soil that's aerobic. Has anybody heard that? You want your soil to be aerobic? In other words, you want it to have lots of oxygen. That's actually not quite correct. You want your soil to be able to breathe, because you need zones in your soil that are actually anaerobic, because that's where free nitrogen fixers fix their nitrogen. And so you want pore spaces where some of those pores are small enough that you'll have water that will fill that pore and create a more or less anoxic or anaerobic environment. And that's where these bacteria will go and fix nitrogen for you on it. In fact, our soils are over-oxidized. They're over-aerobic because we work them too much, and there's too much air getting in, and we're stimulating, organisms that are burning out the humus in our soils and everything else. But you want the soil to breathe. You want air to come in. You want air to be able to go out. So oxygen's coming in. CO2 is able to go out on it. Okay, so that's what soil structure is, though. It's how it's all put together. I think I have a couple of slides here in just a second. It'll kind of give some animations of that. The next term is aggregation. And what aggregation is how those soil particles are brought together. They're aggregated together. So you take a bunch of little silt particles and maybe a few sand particles and some clay, and through charge and glue, chemistry, it's through charge, or electrical attraction, and through biology, it's glue. They're brought together and they make aggregates, and within those aggregates you have different sized pores that are developed as a result of that. And so that's, I don't have any soil here that I could show you maybe. I think I have those illustrations, so that'll be all right. Okay, so how that happens, how they're brought together is a term called flocculation as far as chemistry goes. And it's simply calcium, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Calcium has two positive charges. Those colloids that I talked about, the clay, humus, and root colloid, that has a negative charge, primarily a negative charge. So if calcium has a positive charge and they have a negative charge, what's going to happen? They're going to be attracted to each other, and they're going to grab onto each other. And we're not going to we get to this chemistry, we're not going to have time to do all the details on it, but they're brought together. Now, if you had one hand, how many things could you grab? If you had two, how can you grab? You can bring two together, can't you? Two different things together. Remember that, because that gives the ability of calcium to actually open your soil up. Soften your heart is the way the Bible puts it. But it has, because it has those two, and there's other dynamics to the calcium atom as opposed to magnesium. But anyway, that's called flocculation, where you grab on electrochemically, they grab onto each other and adhere to each other. They're adhered to the surface, they're not absorbed into the surface, they just grab on and hold on to each other. Dispersion is the opposite of that. Dispersion is when has anybody grabbed your hand just with their pinky or something? You don't have a very good grasp. And there are certain conditions, once there's certain conditions put on that grasp fails. That's dispersion. It's where things come apart, really. And you have four major cations, which we'll get into. I'm just saying this right now, but we'll get into it. Calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. Calcium flocculates soils. In other words, opens them up by flocculation. Magnesium, potassium, and sodium all disperse soil and collapse porosity. But you need all of those nutritionally. And you need them in certain amounts. And I'll elaborate on that as we go down the list here. Okay, so then I'm going to be using terms that are related to exchange capacity. And it's the ability, that positive, negative charge, and they're holding hands because they're attracted to each other and everything. Well, if the plant root comes along or a microbe comes along and wants to do an exchange, can I give you a hydrogen in exchange for potassium? Because I need the potassium nutritionally. Or can I give you two hydrogens to get a calcium because there's two charges on that? Potassium only has a single charge. It's an exchange. Did you ever in school, when I was younger in school, kids would trade their lunches all the time. And you'd usually trade your good lunch that your mom made for you for some junky lunch that but anyway, it's the point of you're exchanging. Like, I need this, and I'll exchange you this for that. is what's basically happening. So there's different terms that are used. One is called total exchange capacity, and that's measuring actually the negative charges and the positive charges on those colloids, because they all have some positive charge, and we're going to get into this. So you're measuring all of that, negative and positive, and that's TEC, you'll see it written as. TCEC is total cation exchange capacity. And the next one under it is cation exchange capacity. Well, what's the difference between total cation exchange capacity and cation exchange capacity? Cation are the positively charged elements. Okay, so that's what that term means. The positively charged elements, calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, all those trace metals are all positively charged. That's what a cation is. An anion has a negative charge to it. And we're going to look at that as we go through the different nutrients and everything. The difference between these two is some labs will not run a total cation exchange capacity. They'll only run what they call a cation exchange capacity. They don't measure sodium because they don't think it's significant enough to factor in. But it alters all the data by not doing it. So the only thing I work with is a total. It's a total cation exchange capacity that I actually work with. The total exchange capacity is not really reliable because most of the negative anions are held in humus, and humus can fluctuate depending on how you're treating your soil and everything. So it's not as, you can't measure it quite as well as you can the other. So you can determine the needs in a different way on that. So does everybody follow me so far? I know what I'm saying. Okay. We might get kind of deep into the weeds here a little bit, but I'm going to use these terms, and so I just wanted to try to. Okay, so the next term here is base saturation. Base is just another word for a positively charged cation, and this is where people get into confusion because people use different terms. I mentioned Dr. Kerry Reams. He used different terms than everybody else used, and it just started creating confusion for people. But base and cation, a base is an alkaline or a positively charged molecule or ion, and a cation is a positively charged ion or molecule. It has a positive charge to it. So they both words mean the same thing on it. Why did they just say cation saturation percent or base exchange capacity and just be consistent with the terms that they use? I don't know, but these are the terms that are used, so it's what you wind up seeing. So base saturation percent is just simply saying, okay, how much, if I have a certain size bucket, which is the exchange capacity, is going to tell you how big of a bucket your soil has to hold nutrition. And so base saturation percent is just saying, well, okay, what percent of the bucket is filled with calcium, what percent of the bucket is filled with magnesium, what percent of the bucket is filled with potassium, and what percent of the bucket is filled with sodium. And those percentages are very specific. You want very specific amounts of those in there in order to get the structure. All of these elements are nutritional too, but they're also produce structure in your soil. And so you want specific balance. In fact, you want calcium to dominate. You'll see that in a minute here. But that's what it is. How much of each of these things is filling my bucket on it? Okay? So you got that clear as mud? Okay. Okay, and we already talked about colloid. A colloid just has a charge to it, whether it's a root with a charge on the root, whether it's a clay particle that has a charge, or the humus that has a charge. It just has a charge. That's what a colloid means. Okay, that's all the terms we're going to do. There are some others, but I don't think that it's necessary to. Okay, so here's that chart, and you can look it up. It's just a soil texture chart. And most of the time you can look it up, and it'll tell you how to factor in. So to what type of soil you have. And everybody will say, oh, we have a sandy loam. If you look down to the left there, sandy loam is kind of the ideal soil as far as texture goes. I'm not sure that's completely true, but that's typically what you'll hear is people on sandy loam. But what you do is after you get this, I mean, labs will do this test for you, but you can do it yourself. Once you get your measurements here and you know what percentage of each thing you have, you just look over to the left, it says percent clay. And so if I have 10%, well, let's go up higher than that. Let's say I have 30% clay. So we go up to 30%. And over on the other side, we have the percent silt we have. Trying to figure out how I can get to. Yeah, we can do that. That's okay. You have 30% clay, and go over silt, we'll just make it easy. You have 30% silt. And then on the bottom, what is that? 30 and 30, 60, so then it'll be 40% sand in order to 100%. It'll add up to 100%. So 30 and 30 would be 60. And then you follow the clay, if you start with that, you follow it in until you get to where the 30 comes down at an angle. And then where the sand was at 40, come up at an angle where they all meet, and it's a clay loam. See that? They explain it. It's a little, the way the lines all run, it can get a little bit confusing, but you can go online and you can look up, a soil texture chart, and they'll walk you through how to figure out where you are. And in general, you don't want to be on any one of the extremes. You don't want to be all clay. You don't want to be, high percent clay. You don't want to be all silt or all sand. It's better to be all silt than all sand. Well, it's better to be all silt if you have to have any one. As we get into it, the exchange capacity tends to go up the more clay is in the soil. And the less clay is in the soil, it goes down. And so if you have a sandy soil, your exchange capacity is going to be pretty low. And in fact, you're going to have a small bucket. And we'll get into what that implication is.
In your experience over the 3 decades of doing this, what is the ideal spot?
The ideal spot is to be in a healthy, balanced soil. And if you can avoid extremes, I would put it up more in the loam category or the sandy clay loam. And the only reason I would put it there is because the exchange capacity is enough that you're not having to manage it so intensely. But if you have to add things to it, the bucket's not so big that it's going to cost you so much to try to work with it. Now, the higher the exchange capacity, the more potential that soil has. So it's just you also I have growers with exchange capacity. I've done work with exchange capacities as low as 2, and it's very fragile soil. It's sand. It's almost like beach sand. And when we get into that, I can tell some stories about what we've had to deal with. You need to know what the capacity of your soil is. I'll just tell the illustration now because I had to deal with a apple grower over in North Carolina, and their exchange capacity was in the 3s, very low, very little capacity. And a palm specialist came down because they were having problems with the fruits, and a palm specialist came down from one of the universities further north and everything, and suggested that they needed to put on, I don't remember the numbers on both of them now, it was like 3 tons of gypsum and 2 tons or 3 tons of high calcium lime on that soil. That soil could not handle 1/5 of that. And what wound up happening is, and we can't go into all the chemistry of why, but what wound up happening is the tree started dying because it drove everything out of the soil. It drove all the nutrients, particularly trace minerals. Either tied them up or just drove them out of that soil. And we had to foliar feed those trees. I don't know how long it was now. I remember. We had to foliar feed those trees until we could get that stuff out and get the other stuff back in to the soil. So whoever made that recommendation did not understand the capacity of that soil, even though they were supposed to be a specialist on it. They may have been a specialist on the tree, on the fruit, but as far as the soil went, they didn't know what they were talking about. It had to be addressed. So, but I also have growers with exchange capacities up in the 30s and 40s. And I've got a couple now with really balanced soil, and they can do whatever they want with that soil. So I say that for that, I probably prefer it in like maybe a 10, 12 exchange capacity, because then you're kind of at that place where it's easy to manage, but it's not so so low that it's going to be something you're just constantly going to be putting stuff in to try to keep things where they need to be on it. But you have what you have, and so you can fix any of them. If there are situations, economics is the biggest factor. Any soil can be fixed. It's a matter of how much money you're willing to spend. Yeah, or how much money you have to spend. But in the majority of cases, things are fixable, and they're fixable within a reasonable time frame and reasonable cost. Probably should have put this next slide before this, but this is just an illustration of the different relative sizes of those particles that they measure the texture of your soil with. So sand is anywhere from 2 to down to 0.05 millimeters. Silt is 0.5 to 0.002 millimeters, and clay is less than 0.002. That is very small. You can see relative in this size here. No, this is just an illustration of these different size particles in the soil. Whether it was a sandy soil or not would determine how many of those big round pieces were in the soil relative to the smaller blue ones and red ones. So, how are we doing for time? Ooh.
If someone had, like, say, a sandy soil, do you ever recommend doing raised beds, or kind of do you do this?
Well, we're going to get to it in just a minute, but chemistry can actually take a sandy soil and bring it together so that it has better structure and has better porosity and water holding ability. And this is where you have to adjust it based on the exchange capacity and what type of soil you're dealing with. Because sometimes you want to open it up. If you have a heavy clay soil, you need to open it up. If you have a sandy soil, you need to close it up. But I'll tell you this, more soil probes are broken on sandy soils than they are in clay soils. And you ask yourself, what in the world? If your chemistry is bad on a sandy soil, it will get hard as a rock when it dries out. And you can take a weighted mallet and you can hammer on a soil probe to try to get it in there, and you will just work yourself weary if you don't break the probe to try to get it in. And that's all chemistry. Even though you have these big sand particles as the majority of your soil, the chemistry that's actually holding it together is just bringing it in tight as can be on it. So would I do a raised bed? Maybe. It depends on what there's other things that I would do first. Somebody asked me about raised beds, and I always ask the question, why would you do a raised bed? Normally people do it to concentrate fertility or improve drainage because they have poorly draining soil. If you have that, you can do it, but you can also change those conditions and increase the fertility and increase the porosity of that soil so that it drains well. So it takes time and it takes effort and expense to do raised beds and to maintain raised beds. So if there's a good reason to do it, by all means, do it. If you can address the issues in another way that are more long-lasting, then I think that's a better option. Did somebody else have a question? Bindweed? Yeah, to try to open it up a little bit more and get better drainage. But how well did it improve the bindweed? They said that they did raised beds because of bindweed. How well did it improve the situation with bindweed?
We don't have the problem because there's a barrier between the raised bed and the bindweed. But we were getting to the point where, because bindweed inhibits germination, things weren't even germinating.
Yeah, right.
So
But you put a barrier down.
But we got the bindweed because we did the back to Eden gardening with the mulch and stuff, and it went nuts under there, and we didn't realize, and it just
Yeah.
spread everywhere.
That's just, we're at a point where we need to stop. It's 1 o'clock. So I'm happy to answer a few more questions if you'd like. But we're going to stop with that slide and we'll continue from there. Did you have a question?
I think I'm going to wait. Maybe you can touch on that. How was, how do we actually make better conditions to reduce weed? How do you, what do you do to the ground?
It's all about the chemistry. Well, you can use biology too, but it's all about the chemistry. You change the chemistry, you change the ability of that soil to structure.
And that's what we're headed.
That's where we're headed. Huh?
We're headed, learning how to change that.
Yes.
chemistry.
Yes. Yep. We're working on it. Okay. Any others? Otherwise, we'll break for lunch here. No others right now? Okay. Well, thank you for your attention. We'll pick it up later this afternoon. Okay, let's close with prayer here. We'll have prayer for lunch as well. Father in heaven, we're thankful again for the opportunity to be here and to learn about your creation, and we just pray that we would learn correctly and that we would embrace that correctness. And we just pray that you would help us to retain the information that is being shared and is being heard. We're also thankful that you provide us with the things that we need and the food that we'll be nourished with at lunch, and we just pray that that would be blessed and that the hands that prepared it would be blessed. The gain from it would be used for your service. In Jesus' name, amen.